Professor Jim Michele from the History Department, and I wanted to begin by asking you what interested you about history and medieval history in particular.
Well, I think the main influence on me in terms of becoming a historian was my family background, and particularly conversations I had with my grandmother as I was growing up. She grew up in a Belgian peasant family, and she and my grandfather emigrated to Canada after the Second World War. So they had the experience, wartime experiences in Europe. They had German troops billeted in their house. And then they made a new life for themselves in Canada, and I was fortunate enough to live in a time of great prosperity, but I was enthralled by my grandmother's stories of deprivation and poverty and the difficulty of dealing with all of the great events that had happened in Europe, and it just kind of seemed natural to me that people would be interested in history.
And the Middle Ages?
Middle Ages, I think, is maybe a little bit harder to explain. I think I was raised as a Catholic, and so when I started to learn about the history of Catholicism and the relationship between religion and society as practiced in the Middle Ages, I found it quite intriguing to contrast with my own religious upbringing. And then when I went to graduate school, I came in contact with a professor who taught rural history and economic history, which were types of history that I had never had any contact with as an undergraduate. And I realized that my background as a grandson of a peasant and as somebody who actually grew up on a farm could be extended into the distant past and into the Middle Ages, and there were lots of interesting connections that I was able to make. And so kind of my career developed from there.
Well, it's exactly this connection between the present and the past that Professor Bell and I are discussing in the course that, as you know, deals with 21st century challenges and events in relation to similar ones in the past. And the primary evidence that we're using to talk about how these events and challenges are remembered and created are visual images and artifacts. And our theme this week is historic battles and the way in which images contribute to the way they are remembered. And we wanted to talk with you today about an important medieval battle or conquest, the Norman conquest of England, and its telling in the Bayeux embroidery or tapestry. And I imagine that as a specialist of medieval England, you talk about this tapestry in your courses. Can you just give us a sense of the kinds of courses you teach that might engage this artifact?
I teach a general survey of medieval history from beginning to end, and I often include coverage of England as one of the major powers of medieval Europe, and particularly its involvement with the continent at various points, lengthy wars with France, involvement with the Catholic Church, and contacts with other parts of Northern Europe. And the Norman conquest is a real watershed moment because that was a point at which England's fortunes became much more closely allied with the fortunes of France and in general with the fortunes of Europe as a whole. So it was an extremely important moment for England. It was an extremely important moment for Europe and having England brought into Europe more directly. I also teach upper-level courses in English history, medieval English history, and of course the Norman conquest is extremely important in terms of the subsequent development of England. It's some of the main themes of medieval English history are a strong monarchy, very capable military presence, good relations between central government and the shires, the counties of England, and many of these things are features that were introduced or were greatly extended by the Norman conquest, because the Normans were not only successful militarily, but they were also effective rulers of England, and so they really shaped the institutions of the country.
Well, I'm really happy to get your interpretation of the tapestry because as an art historian, I talk about the Bayeux Tapestry in several of my classes. In the introductory survey, 105, it serves as an example of Romanesque art. And when I teach an upper-level seminar on pictorial narrative, I look at it in terms of the visual strategies of storytelling that it engages. So I'm looking forward to this conversation between an art historian and a historian using this example. So let's turn to the actual events. The most recent interpretations of the Bayeux Tapestry argue that it was produced between 1066 and 1068, so almost contemporary to the events that it depicts. Can you begin by telling us a little bit about those events?
Well, certainly. One of the things that you need to know to understand the events of the Norman Conquest are the complicated political situation that existed both in England and in Normandy and in Scandinavia in the decades leading up to 1066 and up to the conquest. So within England, there was a history of contact with both Normandy and with Scandinavia. There had been Viking incursions from Scandinavia into England that had gone on for almost 2 centuries before the Norman Conquest. And there was lots of traffic back and forth. There was lots of political movement back and forth. There was intermarriage of royal families back and forth between the English dynasties and dynasties in Scandinavia. There was very heavy settlement of Danish settlers in parts of eastern England. So there was not just a political connection, but there was also a kind of social connection back between Scandinavia and England. And then this connection between Scandinavia and England was then kind of amplified and complicated by the emergence of Normandy as a kind of separate power base that also had connections back to Scandinavia, settlement by Vikings, actually creation of the Duchy of Normandy by Normans. And so there was a kind of triangular relationship in effect through much of the 10th and 11th centuries, with England being one axis of this, and with Scandinavia being a second axis of this, and Normandy being a third axis of this. And again, there was a tremendous amount of intermarriage. There was movement of people back and forth. There was some colonization. There was some movement of church officials and other government officials. So there was a very extremely interwoven set of political, economic, social relations that bound these 3 areas together. And this really rose to the fore in the 11th century, and particularly with the reign of Edward the Confessor. Edward was a representative of the Anglo-Saxon traditional monarchy, but as a child, he was driven from England by the successful invasion of a Danish warlord who became the king in England. And while this king, Canute, was in power in England, Edward spent his time in Normandy, where he was sheltered and protected, and developed close ties with members of the Norman ducal family, and probably some level of affection for the Normans as his patrons and protectors while he was in exile from his own land. So probably at some point in this kind of childhood and young person's experience, this affection for the Normans influenced his thinking then, when he was able to go back and return to his kingdom and assume the kingship. He did ultimately become king, but he became king without children. And so the issue that emerged as his reign progressed was what would happen after Edward died, who would be his successor. And it seems fairly clear. I mean, the evidence is not 100% certain, but it seems fairly clear that at some point in his reign, he decided that his successor should be the Duke of Normandy, that he was in some sense repaying the debt that he owed to the Normans for taking him in and protecting him.
William the Conqueror.
William the Conqueror, right. So he made his plan known to his followers, that this was his intention, that he would be succeeded by William the Conqueror, so that was kind of the game plan, I guess, probably for a couple of decades, probably through the 1040s and even the 1050s, but the one person who was unhappy with this arrangement was the most powerful person in England after the king, or you might say even more powerful than the king, which was the Harold Godwinson, who was a very powerful earl, and was basically the king's right-hand man.
And brother-in-law.
And brother-in-law, true, yes. And who had a family history of kind of being a strong, wealthy, powerful family who advised kings and who sometimes ran the kingdom in the king's absence, or managed his affairs as if though they were kings themselves. So Harold enters the picture, and in this very complicated arrangement where there's uncertainty about who William's successor will be. There's kind of general understanding that Edward has made some kind of an arrangement with Duke William to succeed him. There's also awareness that the Scandinavian influence and the Scandinavian powers are not simply going to sit by and watch as power is decided between the Normans and the English, because they have long-standing claims. They have intermarried with the English royal family. They have people who have settled and colonized parts of England, and they have their own ambitions and their own plans. So as we move towards into the 1060s, everybody is aware that there is a looming crisis of succession, and people are positioning themselves to be in the best position to take over, to succeed when the time comes.
And the Tapestry presents perhaps an argument about who was the legitimate successor of Edward. And let's turn to the Tapestry. So it's very long, about 230 feet long and a foot and a half high, and about half the Tapestry is devoted to the events leading up to William's conquest of England. And let's begin by thinking about those events. Do you think that the Tapestry is presenting a justification for William's conquest of England?
Well, I suppose I would be willing to agree that it's a justification. I mean, I think the thing that is certainly undeniable is that it's a story that's told from a Norman point of view, and it presents William's claims as having legitimacy. It presents William as the kind of decisive figure. It invariably presents the Normans in a good light, and it has a number of things that present Harold in a negative light.
Well, the first surviving event is a conversation between Edward and Harold, and there's no indication within the image what Edward is saying to him. In your view of it, is in fact this conversation a statement of Edward telling Harold to go and tell William that he will succeed Edward?
That is the standard interpretation, and I think it's a valid interpretation. I think it has to be seen, that particular scene has to be seen in the context of the subsequent scenes where Harold finds his way into William's hands. So he makes his way to Normandy, which is a very mysterious part of this whole series of events. Why would Harold have traveled to the place where his obvious enemy and his obvious opponent, his obvious rival for the throne, resided and
then
held
he's
power?
Kidnapped. Why was he kidnapped? By
Right.
whom?
Right. So the debate among historians has been kind of indeterminate. Why did Harold end up in Normandy? Some historians have thought it was just by accident, that he was sailing and got lost basically, and ended up crossing the channel and in the hands of one of William's supporters and vassals. Others have suggested, and this is probably the dominant narrative, that Harold was carrying out Edward's command to inform William that he would be his successor. And so, so this was certainly a version of the story that the Normans liked to tell, because it made William's title and his claim to be the King of England more legitimate, more more acceptable to the English. If the leading English contender for the throne had actually decided and knew in advance and had accepted in advance that he would be the second fiddle when the time for succession came.
You said that Harold wasn't presented in a positive light, and yet there is the sequence of events in which he demonstrates his valor as a knight and his strength.
That's true. And I think, I mean, it certainly is not a character assassination, and it certainly is not an attempt to demean or diminish Harold on every occasion. In fact, I think that the strategy of the designer of the tapestry was to make Harold a worthy foe. Was to demonstrate that there were features, there were things about Harold that were very praiseworthy, that were high, to be esteemed in the culture of the 11th century. So he's portrayed as he's presented visually presented in the tapestry as a big, strong warrior. He's presented. There's one scene in particular where he rescues some of William's men when they go out to raid together, to fight together. So there are some scenes that actually portray Harold in a very positive light. And in fact, it's also quite interesting later on that they are willing to include that he is king. They do refer to him as king after his coronation. So they didn't come up with a term or some way of pretending that the title was completely invalid, or that this episode hadn't happened, that Harold had never actually become king. So there is that kind of recognition of that Harold is from a well-established family. He's an important figure. He plays a key role in the events of the conquest. But at the same time, there's also an undermining of Harold that takes place in the tapestry.
Okay, can you talk about some of those examples?
Sure. There are two examples in particular that are I think the most noteworthy. The first example is that Harold is depicted swearing an oath of some kind to William, and the presumption is that he's swearing an oath of fealty, that he is recognizing William's claim to succession, and that he will support William when the time comes. And the emphasis, the iconographic emphasis on this scene is amplified by the fact that he's taking this oath. He's touching two reliquaries, one with each hand. So this is really making a very powerful statement that this is something that is, absolutely sacrosanct. That this oath to William is completely, as powerful, as strong as it can possibly be. So that's I think a key scene. There's also one that's perhaps not quite as straightforward, but I think that is also fairly damning of Harold, and that is that when they show the coronation, they show beside him the figure of Archbishop Stigand, who was somebody who was widely known as because he held the office of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he held it illegitimately. He was not accepted by the Pope, and he had been excommunicated several times in the preceding decades. So the association between Harold and Stigand, and the presumption or the image that's portrayed that Stigand had a role in the coronation is a way of making a kind of dig at Harold, or a critique of Harold's true kingship, because in fact the kingship was conferred, the very ceremony was conferred by an illegitimate archbishop. So the sanction, the ecclesiastical and holy sanction of kingship was not conferred properly on Harold.
Right, but some people have argued that Stigand at the time was the legitimate archbishop, so that in fact in the history that the tapestry portrays, his coronation was legitimate. And the other component of that scene where Edward is on his deathbed that people point to is the figure at his feet who has been identified as Harold. And Edward is gesturing to this figure, and some people have argued that in fact this is a recognition that Edward's final wish was to have Harold as his successor.
Certainly, and I mean, this is an interesting. It's telling a story from a particular point of view. There's uncertainty again. When historians turn to the original primary sources, there's uncertainty about which version is the accurate version. There is another interpretation of that series of scenes, which is that it's a subtle critique of Harold because he's the interval between the death of Edward and the assumption of the kingship by Harold is very short. And it's problematic that there was not more time, that Harold became king the day after Edward died. So I think there is some ambiguity there, and I think there was probably ambiguity in the mind of the person who created Tapestry because he does, as I mentioned a minute ago, he does recognize that Harold was king, and the text at that portion says something to the effect that there was acclamation, or there was some kind of a statement. There was some kind of recognition, I guess is the word, recognition by the leading English magnates that Harold should be the next king. So it's entirely possible that Edward changed his mind at some point, and that he decided toward the end of his life that the kingdom would be in better hands if it was left to Harold. That he made this known on his deathbed, that there was an acceptance and a willingness to go along on the part of the other leading families of England, and that the coronation had to take place quickly because of the crisis situation that England found itself in 1066. Right. So there are different readings of it.
Yes, but despite the ambiguity, William did invade England.
Right.